All right. So welcome everybody, part 2 of our lockdown learning series. Tonight we are talking about, we're not talking about magic, no contracts tonight. There weren't contracts last week either. But we're talking about vaccines, which is a topic which has been in the news a lot over the last couple of days. I'm sure everybody's heard about the 2 vaccines that have been developed, a lot of excitement, which hopefully will help us to get our lives back to normal some way, shape or form sooner rather than later, and we'll be able to have machane again. Yay. But so in terms of our topic tonight, like I said, we're talking about vaccines. And there's a lot of questions which are raised by this, a lot of ethical questions, a lot of moral questions, lots of halachic questions as well. You know, when you think about vaccines, if we imagine, we fast forward now a few months to the time when we have these vaccines, hopefully, there are all these questions that are raised. Should a person be taking a vaccine? Does a person have to take a vaccine? Can schools and society and different places put sort of sanctions on people who decide not to take vaccines? Another question that gets asked is, what about when the vaccine becomes available? Obviously, it's not going to be unlimited, at least at the beginning. There's only going to be a certain limited dosage. Who should get it? Who should get it first? How do we distribute? Lots of different questions that are asked like that. But we're not there yet. We still don't have the vaccine. So we want to talk about, in terms of developing it, in terms of getting the vaccine, in terms of the trials. These are raising a lot of very, very interesting questions themselves as well. And I want to talk a little bit tonight about what they call challenge trials, which I'll explain in a moment what that is. I think the first time I heard about this was when Gideon a few months ago sent me, it was from Queen Mary's, wasn't it? That there was a trial that was going on, and they were offering students, to just replied yes. They were offering students to be paid a certain amount of money in order to come and infect themselves with coronavirus under certain controlled conditions. And that was one question. They asked me, would you be allowed to do this halachically? And that would be maybe one question in terms of, I think it's a little bit of a slightly different nuance to what we're talking about now, as to whether you could put yourself at risk, for monetary gain, which we'll get to. That might be a question. But in terms of question about these challenge trials, let me open up some of the sources. They first started talking about this. It got into the news just a couple of weeks ago. You can see here, source number 2. As I said, anybody who wants these sources afterwards, I'm happy to send them to you. But in October, so just a few weeks ago, this article came out in Nature called "Dozens to be Deliberately Infected with Coronavirus in UK Human Challenge Trials." But the first time this was really spoken about was probably in March. If we go back to March, there was this article also, which is published in Nature, as follows: should scientists infect healthy people with coronavirus to test vaccines? You read it, it sounds a little bit
Rav, we can still see only your sheet, not the article.
Okay, let's fix that. Sorry, one sec. See the article now? Yeah, okay. So it says, this was published in Nature, like I said, in March. Should scientists infect healthy people with coronavirus to test vaccines? This is a radical proposal. And as you can hear, it sounds pretty radical. The point of medicine is to cure people, is to make people better. And here we're talking about willfully infecting healthy people and making them sick. I can tell you that this caused a lot of controversy. This was in March when this article was published. It's already been cited over 50 times in different literature. You can go and you can look it up. And a lot of arguments back and forth, including not in Nature, in the Journal of Infectious Disease. I'll show you some of the letters in a moment. There was some back and forth. It got quite heated. But let's just understand a little bit in terms of what we are talking about. Why would you want to infect healthy people? Just to understand what's behind it, and then we can talk about the question. So, as hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions, avoid social contact to spare themselves and their communities from coronavirus. Again, now this was written in March. We didn't really know what was coming. We, in a bit of a sense, we still don't know what's coming, right? With the waves have gone up and down in terms of how many people are being sick and getting affected, and we don't know. But nowadays, everybody's talking about a vaccine. As I said, just this week, we've heard very promising news on that front. I'm talking about how many scientists see a vaccine as the only solution to the pandemic. Now, of course, there's clinical safety trials. And one of the things we haven't mentioned so far is that as much as people want a vaccine, there's obviously a problem if you're going to rush through the safety. Maybe you have a vaccine that's not safe or that has side effects. at best, people won't want to take it, but worse than that, people could take it and still get sick. So it needs to be done properly. As much as the world's working together and different scientists, different institutions to try and streamline this process, nonetheless, it has to go through all the steps. And there are generally 3 phases of the testing of vaccines. And typically what interests us right now is phase 3, right? So we talk about large phase 3 studies. What happens in phase 3 trial, which you can see here, thousands to tens of thousands of people receive either a vaccine or a placebo. Placebo meaning would receive a dose, but it doesn't actually have any active medical ingredient inside. And again, people wouldn't know what they've received. And then the researchers could track who becomes infected. Of course, this is going to take a long time because you're waiting for this quantity of people who get sick, who could then come forward to do the trial, who could then get either the vaccine or the placebo, and then you could track them. So scientists came up with this. Again, this is not the first time that it's been done. This concept of a challenge trial we mentioned in other contexts as well. But this is the option. So a quick option would be to conduct a human challenge study, which would be what? Involve exposing perhaps, say, 100 healthy young people to the virus and seeing whether those who get the vaccine escape infection. So essentially, what they're trying to do here is not avoid any of the rigorous safety checks in order to find out that this vaccine works. But instead of waiting an unquantified amount of time for many, many people to get sick and then test them and then track them, what they're suggesting is that get a group of people together in the first place, make them all sick, and give them all the vaccine. And again, you hear how this is where it's going to get even more complicated, because you're saying, let's say we take 100 people, we're going to make them all sick, and you have to then divide into 2 groups. Only half of them are actually going to get the vaccine, which is, we're hoping, will make them better. The other half are going to receive a placebo, which won't make them better. And once they're sick, it's really out of our hands, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. So that was the idea to create this challenge trial. As I said, that's been discussed since March, and that has had very many different reactions. We'll see some of them a little bit later on. And then recently, in October, this got into the news again in terms of this question about UK human challenge trials, that I'm not sure if this particular trial has actually begun or it was just spoken about. Share with you a moment. But this is it again, and it's the same discussion. Proponents of the trial say they can be run safely and help to identify effective vaccines, but others have questioned their value. So you can read a little bit about that afterwards. So the question is, obviously there are moral questions that this raises. Obviously there are halachic questions that this raises. So at this point, I'm going to open up to the floor. Please feel free to unmute yourselves. And I'll hear from you. What do people think? Is this something which is okay to do, which should be done? And there's 2 questions that are really whether society is doing this, but let's assume society is doing this. Is a person allowed to go, should a person go and volunteer to take part in such a trial? What would be the reasons to say yes? What would be the reasons to say no? Don't all shout at once.
The reason to say no is that you're putting yourself at risk. A reason to say yes, it's getting us close to a vaccine which will save, millions of lives. So,
right.
And I think also another reason to say yes is that they need a certain amount of people for the trial, and at the end of the day, they will get that amount of people. And so, if you're worried about, risking your life, why is your life any more important than anyone else's? That you shouldn't be at risk and someone else should. And I had another thought, but that's why I sounded like I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten it.
Oh, okay. So let us know if you remember. But that's a great point, and we're going to come back to that. So we're going to come back to that very soon. Again, you asked the question, and this is actually a sentence you've taken, word for word from the Gemara, which is, who says that? The way the Gemara phrase it is that who says it in a different context? Who says that your blood is redder, right? Why should one person be more at risk or less at risk than anybody else? That's essentially, that's the question we're asking. Anybody else want to say? Anybody else think whether these kind of things are ethical or not?
I mean, on that is surely the fact that you have a chiyuv to protect your life, and therefore, in some ways, especially as it's passive. So, who says that the whole logic of who said that your blood's better than theirs is normally when you would have to be doing something to kill them, whereas this is a passive one. And also, there's the issue that I feel Rav once could have said to me. is there's the issue of you actually becoming ill in a very practical sense of a chol lefanenu, as opposed to saving people who in a theoretical world will be ill later.
Okay, fair. So that's another question in terms of whether this is somebody who might become ill later on, or whether somebody is ill now. We could say, again, when we're talking about a pandemic which has affected, again, I've lost track of the numbers. I mean, how many is it? 50 million? I don't know how many across the world have been infected already. But it's hard to say that this is something theoretical. I mean, this is very much something practical that's here, and that we know that there are people that are getting sick. Fair. Anybody else want to say something, or we'll move on? Okay. So if I go back to the sheet just for a second. So again, this is in one of those 50 articles that I said in which this original, provocative idea was cited. So they give a bit of a summary in terms of, this is from an ethical perspective. What are the arguments against these experiments? And again, these are the 5 main arguments that are brought. One, we're talking about a significant risk of harm, possibly death to the participants, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit more. Experiments might not actually result in a usable vaccine. Might be impossible for somebody to give free consent. Talk about that briefly. Then there's more, other concerns about what this does to the reputation of research. Might be the start of a slippery slope, etc. So now the question, as always, with these things, we want to know, this is the ethical angle, we want to know the halachic angle as well, which is obviously related. And like so many of these questions, when we ask, what does halakha have to say about this? Where do we look? Where do we start? Where are we going to open up? Obviously, over the last 200, 300 years, many tshuvot have been written about medical ethics. I'd say probably more than other areas of modern technology and different questions, which are still almost, in a sense, almost being developed. We're aren't necessarily so sure how to apply, timeless halachic principles to them, because they haven't existed, because they haven't come up, because the poskim haven't dealt with them. Certainly, medical ethics has been dealt with for a very, very long time. But nonetheless, 300 years is a very long time. We go back, certainly the days of the Gemara, the days of the Shulchan Aruch, medicine was very different to what it is now. Anybody here who's ever learned, some of the medical sections of the Gemara, which again, according to just about all of the Rishonim or the modern day poskim, certainly, we don't take our medical advice from the Gemara or from the Rambam, who was, the leading doctor of his day, but medicine has moved on since then. So where do we look in terms of this? So we're not going back. We're not going to find an explicit answer in terms of how medicine should conduct itself. But what we do find is, again, the sugya of risk. That's where we have to look in terms of what kind of a risk can we take on ourselves? What level of risk is a person obligated, allowed to take on themselves? And this is something which has been dealt with for many generations. So we have to look at it on a few different levels. First of all, we have to look at the question of whether a person can put themselves at risk at all. Then we need to look at whether a person can put themselves at risk if it's going to be saving themselves ultimately, in a way which might be theoretical or might not be, in a way which is going to maybe be saving others, in a way which is certainly practical, or in maybe there's something else to it, which I'll come back to at the end. So first of all, the default position, I think we have to realize, is that we can't put ourselves at risk unnecessarily. So I think here a little bit tongue in cheek, but if you look at what's been going on in the world over the last few months, you might not realize it, and many people seem to have forgotten this. But one is not allowed to put themselves in a situation of risk unnecessarily. In a moment, I'll define what that word unnecessarily means. But the many examples of this, many different psukim, in the Gemara, Rishonim, I could have brought many sources for this. I've just brought 2 very brief ones. The Shulchan Aruch actually has 2 different simanim, one in Choshen Mishpat and one in Orachaim, talking about the fact that we can't do things which are dangerous. And now again, some of the examples, if you go through, you see some of the things that are dangerous. For example, the Shulchan Aruch talks about, eating fish and meat together. Again, nowadays that doesn't seem like something which is dangerous. It's according to modern science. Discussion as to how we would resolve that. But certainly the principle is, and always has been, you can't do something which is going to cause a danger to your health, to your life. Over your source number 6, this isn't actually one of the halachot in the Shulchan Aruch. I just brought the heading for the siman in Choshen Mishpat, where he talks about different things which are dangerous, talks about the mitzvah of a ma'akeh. A person has to put a fence around their rooftop. If they have a balcony that's high or something like that, they have to put a fence so that nobody falls off and dies. And really, that from there we learn the prototype that any obstacle, anything which is going to cause you undue harm, needs to be prevented, needs to be avoided. Quite a few as well from Shut Minchat Asher from Rav Osher Weiss in his Truvot, which he wrote is not related to Corona in general. He says Tamtzit Advarim. In reading source number 7, he says the essence of this. This is at the end of a long Tshuva. He just summarizes. Kolod lo medubar b'sakana krova ugmura. Mutar li'achid lestaken. Sorry, so this is after he's discussed the fact that we cannot just put ourselves in a situation of danger. Everybody here probably realizes intuitively that there are many situations in life that carry some level of danger. There is some level of risk, right? Every time you walk out, every time you step outside of your house, there's risk. Anytime you step onto the road, anytime you get into a car, anytime you go on a plane, there's going to be a risk. So the question is, obviously, it doesn't mean that we have to go to a situation where there is a 0% risk. But how do we measure it? So he says again, he says, so long as we're not dealing with an immediate and direct risk, you would be allowed to take such a risk, right? You're allowed to drive a car. Again, in order to receive a certain benefit which is necessary. This is something which is very hard to put a number on, to put a quantity on. And it's also quite hard for our modern ears to hear. But what he says is that it depends on the level of risk and it depends on the level of benefit from whatever activity you get, right? So, and it kind of goes the two go hand in hand. Something which is, there is no level of, for example, you might ask, can a person go, be a race car driver? Can a person go and go, I don't know, bungee jumping or skydiving, all sorts of things, let's assume, which is an activity which is objectively carries a higher risk than just, stepping outside your house. If there's not going to be any greater tangible benefit for that, then we may not be able to. Daniel, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, based on that, would there be room to potentially say, given that it's a global pandemic and the likelihood is I'm going to get it anyway, isn't it better for me to get it when my health will be monitored by experts and professionals on a regular basis and whatever else?
It's fantastic questions. Fantastic question. We'll come back to it. It's mentioned in some of the articles which I showed you before. I do want to come back to that at the end. It's a great point. But again, so essentially, but so what we set up to this point is that if there is a, let's call it clear and present danger, you would not be allowed to enter. As the danger goes down and the tangible benefit from engaging in whatever activity goes up, then there's room to then there's room to start talking. What constitutes an acceptable activity for which you're allowed to put yourself at risk for? So obviously for your health, right? You might there might be a medical procedure or medicine, again, which are proven, which have might have a side effect. There's a level of risk, but you'd be, if it's going to heal the person, that would be allowed. One which might be surprising to some people, but also in terms of parnasa, in terms of a livelihood, right? The Gemara gives examples that a person is, if a person has a job where, it gives the example, talks about somebody who's working in a field, and he has to, climb up a ladder, he has to go and harvest the fruit, and he has to, it might be a potentially dangerous activity. If that's the way that a person earns their livelihood, they would be, they would be allowed to do that. By the way, just yesterday was announced Israel's about to send their second astronaut into space. Some of you may have heard. So this is another question which is asked by the poskim. For example, it says, is a person allowed to go into space? Assuming a person has the money and the qualifications and the capabilities to do so. It is, everybody agrees that going into space is a very risky activity. Would you be allowed to take that risk on or not? This is something which is discussed. Okay, but let's keep it a little bit more down to earth at the moment. The question becomes, are you allowed to risk yourself? And essentially what we're asking is, you're trying to save other people. Because the idea here behind the vaccine, that at the end of the day, as we've said, there's a global pandemic. There are millions of people around the world that have gotten it, that are likely to get it. We want to save essentially want to save others, right? If a person wants to protect themselves best, you don't go and voluntarily get yourself infected. But can you go and get infected in order to help produce this vaccine in order to save other people? So the first source I want to show, there's a Gemara, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. You may not realize you're familiar with it, but as soon as I start reading, you'll identify. This is the Gemara in Bava Metzia, which says as follows. Talks about two people who are walking in the desert, right? And there happens to be one jug of water that's left between them. And again, the case is there is one jug of water, which if one person drinks the entire jug, they will survive. If you split it halfway, then both of them will die. As the Gemara says, if both of them are going to try and drink, they're going to be very, very nice and altruistic and give it to their friend to drink as well. They end up killing each other. Only one person drinks, he'll survive. So Darash ben Petora was one of the Tanaim, says as follows. He says actually, says, how can one, leave his friend to die in the desert, and take the water for himself? Actually, they should both die. This is not the opinion which is accepted to halacha. This is not what in all the Rishonim and all the poskim and everybody accepts the halacha over here, like the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva taught us, this is a principle we have throughout, that your life actually comes before somebody else's. Again, does that mean that you are more important than them? No, not necessarily. Does that mean that, in the language we used earlier, that your blood is rather than somebody else's? No, but your obligation is to look after yourself first before you look after other people. It's like the classic analogy everybody knows when you go on an airplane and they show you the flight safety information, video, whatever, and they talk about when the oxygen masks come down. They always say, if you're traveling with children or you're traveling with other people who need assistance, you make sure you put your own oxygen on first before you give it to somebody else. Your life comes first. Again, this isn't about being selfish, isn't about being, anything like that. And therefore, if the situation is that a person was going to endanger their own life to the same degree, to try and save somebody else, that would not be something which, certainly not something which they're required to do. Interesting discussion amongst the poskim as to when Rabbi Akiva over here says that your life comes first, does that mean that you are, does that mean you're not allowed to let the other person drink? Or does that mean that you that you don't have to let the other person drink? Right? There's discussion, but most think that no, you would have to take it for yourself. So in terms of accepting this risk, everybody agrees that if you are putting yourself in a grave risk, to save somebody else, you shouldn't be doing that. Certainly you don't have to be doing that, and you probably shouldn't be doing that. Where the question becomes a little bit more fuzzy is, and again, we can't really put numbers on these things. We can't put, we talk about this, not just this area, but many different things in terms of halacha. We like statistics, we like to know, there's a 50% chance, there's a 90% chance, it's one way, it's that way, it's, different numbers. But these things are complex. These things have to be judged really on a case-by-case basis, and we can't put objective numbers to them. But what we say is as follows. Let's say that somebody else is certainly going to die. Somebody else, we know that they are in danger. And you could risk yourself, you could take on a certain element of risk. It might be 10%, it might be 20%, 30%. Right? It's not negligible. There is a risk, but it's nowhere near as definite and certain as the case of the other person. Right? You'll probably be okay, but you might not. Now, this isn't the case of Rabbi Akiva and somebody else in the desert anymore, right? Everybody hears this. The case that we saw in the Gemara Bava Metzia was, if you don't drink, you will die. If he doesn't drink, he will die, right? Or she, whatever it is. There's the same degree of danger to both people. Yeah, we're talking about something else where no, there is a clear danger to somebody else, and there is a possible, maybe even minute danger to you. Do you have to, or can you take on that level of risk in order to save somebody else? And this is essentially much more similar to our question regarding the vaccine, and this is where it becomes a little bit more fuzzy. So I want to go back to Rav Shavais, as we said before, and this is also from two Chuvot later in his Shut in Minchas Asher. Again, this was published a number of years ago. This was before Corona. We'll come back to later on what he says specifically about Corona. But he says like this. So just look on the right-hand side first of all. So he says like this. Right? So the other person is, as we said, in clear and present danger. And you have a chance of saving that person by taking a certain element of risk on yourself. And the critical point is, it's less than the risk that they're undergoing. So, as you could probably have guessed, there's going to be a machloket. And it is a three-way machloket. I haven't brought you the three-way machloket, but you can probably guess, there is an opinion that says, absolutely, you would have to take the risk. There is an opinion that says, absolutely not, you're not allowed to take the risk. And then comes the middle ground, and this is probably the way the halacha is. This is the way Rabbi Shavai rules. He says as follows on the left-hand side. Because he goes through and he brings, there are different shuvot. I could have shown you the Rishonim and the Achronim, and they say things which sometimes seem a little bit contradictory. But at the end of the day, it depends on the element of risk. And as I said, it's very hard because we can't, put a number on it. But he says, "Im sakana gmurai v'karov l'sakana she'ala nitzal," as in if the risk that you're going to endure is a definite danger, and it's going to come close to the risk that person is under already, the one you're trying to save. So karav ha'davar she'esh isur. He says, I would say that that's probably going to be forbidden. A person has to save themselves first. On the other hand, if the risk is very low and you probably are going to be able to save them and you're both going to live, so then he says, midat chasidut yav she'ein b'zeh chiyuv. Very interestingly, we're not saying that it is an obligation because you are still undergoing a certain amount of risk, but nonetheless, it's certainly a midat chasidut. This is a pious act. This is the proper thing to do, and you should try and save them. If there is a negligible risk to you, as you said, everything that a person does carries some risk. If it's really negligible, then it's probably close to saying that you are obligated. Right. So now, when we come to these vaccines, certainly I think we can't say that it is nicha beyoter. There is a risk. Right? Nobody knows, a person's going to get, and as time goes on over the months, we're learning more and more about this virus, and sometimes things that we thought we knew, we don't know, and nobody knows why, one person might get it and react in a certain way, and another person might not. So there definitely is an element of risk here, but this is the question: is that the amount that's going to justify saying, yes, you can put yourself in that situation, yes, you can do that? And it's going to be very, very difficult to quantify that. Just before I carry on with that, I want to go back to some of the medical literature in a moment, and then we'll finish off with the halacha. But I want to share something else which is very interesting. It's the tshuva from the Shvut Yaakov, written about over 200 years ago, maybe a little bit less. I don't remember the exact year, but this is one of the classics in terms of medical halacha. This is one of the classic questions, and over here he talks about. Because obviously, when we're talking about a vaccine, we're talking about saving other people. It's talking about saving yourself. And this is a question which he was asked, which was there a certain doctor that there was a patient who was terminal. He had a terminal illness, and he had essentially 2 or 3 days to live, and that was it. Now, there was a certain medical procedure which could have been done, but it was untested. And it was possible that this would heal the person completely, and they would live for a lot longer. It's also possible that it would kill them and they would die immediately. Now, we know there's a value to every single day of life. There's value to every single moment of life. We can't do anything to shorten a person's life. So the Shvut Yaakov was asked, can you give the person this treatment? It may save them, but it may shorten their life. You may be hastening their demise. And he says very interestingly, he says, Benidon zeh, I've just brought you have the question, but here's the answer, or the end of it. He says, Benidon zeh, keivan shevadai yamut, because this person is definitely going to die. Over there, we're not worried about the, we leave aside the certainty and we go for the risk. We go for the doubt that you might be able to save him. He goes on, he says, nonetheless, this has to be done. You need to consult with all the experts. There needs to be a lot of deliberation. You need to make sure that you're doing the right thing. But he says, yes, you could a person could accept the extra risk on themselves in order to save themselves. Again, in our case, it's not completely analogous to our case because Over here, we're talking about a person who's not, certainly going to die. Hopefully they, in any event, are going to live for many years going on. So again, the question is, how do we measure this and where do we go? We don't know. This is the biggest problem. It goes back to Daniel's point. We don't know exactly what the risk is. It might be, ironically, it might actually be safer for the person, right, to volunteer to do the trial, because then they have as Daniel said, then they have the best care. Have a look at this, number 11. This goes back to that article from March. And he's explaining, and said it was very, very provocative when this came out, and the person who had this idea is explaining why it's not so provocative. In his opinion, he says, you'd also protect study participants by examining them daily or more frequently for infection, by providing them with excellent treatment immediately upon detecting infection. That's not trivial. I've advised critical care doctors preparing for surgeries of coronavirus. We strongly expect, based on experience in Italy and more, again, there has been experience of this now in this country also, unfortunately, that there will be acute shortages of critical care resources. By the time vaccine candidates are tried, there may be some treatments that are proven to work, and surely the brave volunteers we recruit should be assured ready access to those. The dramatic sounding exposure of healthy volunteers to the virus is therefore adding less net risk than you might think. It might even be curiously safer for some to join the study than to await probable infection and then try to rely on the general healthcare system. Right? That was exactly Daniel's point. So that is one way of looking at this. Again, it's difficult to, it's difficult to prove this, because at the end of the day, we don't know who's going to get sick and who's not. And this goes back to what we said before in terms of that which is certain and that which is maybe doubtful. If a person doesn't have the sickness right now, so we know they don't have it, they might get it in the future, but that's a theoretical possibility. But making them sick is, making something definite, which then we don't know how they're going to come out of it. One of the points that was raised by many in terms of this article is that, ultimately we're doing this for the good of mankind. We're doing this for the good of many. They recognize there's still a risk to that person. That person might get very, very ill. The person might not survive. You're saving many other lives along the way. That was one of the arguments that was put forward in this original article. I have here a letter from a doctor in Italy, again, which was written in March. So I'm not sure, as to how much this had, already affected and exactly where they were in Italy at the time, but quite a strong response to this. And she says as follows. She says a few different things. But one of the arguments is like this. The authors stress many lives would be saved. However, utilitarian morality is not applicable in the medical field. This is a very interesting point. I mean, those of you who were last year, we gave a share once about the trolley dilemma, about autonomous cars. I think some of you were there. We spoke about this question of utilitarian morality, i.e., what that means is that we just look at the numbers. At the end of the day, are we going to save one person or are we going to save 5 people? Is one life going to be lost or 10 lives going to be lost? And you say however many, the most lives we save. And when you ask people, at least from an abstract philosophical kind of thing, most people are utilitarian until you put names and faces onto the questions that you ask them, and then it's not so sure. People would say, of course you save 10 people as opposed to saving 1. You say, if that 1 is somebody who's related to you and the 10 are, total strangers in a different country, then people aren't so sure. So it's very, very tricky, this question of utilitarian morality. In ethics classes and, moral dilemmas, they talk about it a lot. But what she's saying is that when it comes to practical application in medicine, it doesn't work that way. The logic of sacrificing a few to save many is not acceptable, even if the trial concerns a fundamental vaccine. If it's right, the risk to a few is justified by the potential, and again, this is the key point, only potential benefit to many. So then would it also be right to say it's appropriate to sacrifice young people to create a vaccine for a disease that mainly kills elderly people? In fact, the elderly are considered by some much less useful to society than the young. Provocative here on purpose, but obviously these are extreme examples. They have to understand the danger of utilitarian logic in the medical scientific field, right? And as I said, for those who were in that share about, I don't remember when it was, but it was last year, we spoke about autonomous cars and this question of utilitarianism. Very clear from a number of sources, the Torah is not exclusively utilitarian in its morality, right? We are not allowed to go and sacrifice one life in order to save the many, and we have explicit sources about that as well. So that's one argument that goes against this. I I'll just share with you some of the response that was written. And again, this is from that original author who suggested this idea of the challenge trials. And they say, and he doesn't over here directly address the point of whether it's utilitarian logic or not, but what he says is, look, we don't get to that. We're not saying that, we're happy to leave, let one person die in order to save others. We're saying that the chances, the risks are very, very low. And he talks about, Dr. Kofi rails against our comparison of human challenge studies to organ donation, but the risk of donor death from live kidney donation is about 3 per 10,000, which is similar to a recent estimate of risk of death after severe acute after COVID-19. Again, I don't know if those numbers have changed, among people in their 20s. Lowering the age cap would reduce the risk. Furthermore, the risk to challenge volunteers may be lower if restricted to those with no underlying health condition. What they're saying is, yes, the risk here is as low as possible. It's lower than risk that we would take in other things as well. They say actually something interesting as well, which is that they would choose participants, not just those who have a lower risk of being affected adversely by the virus, but those who actually have a higher risk of getting the virus, right? And therefore, since there's a high background risk anyway, and again, this is what Daniel was saying, put them in a situation where they'll get the infection, but where it's controlled, where they have the critical care that they might need, etc. Again, the problem with all of this is that we don't know exactly what the numbers are and how they might be. But over here, what I really want to point out, and I think this is the key to understanding, what halakha has to say on this. Obviously, and I hope should be obvious by this point, is that we aren't going to be able to give a black and white, blanket answer. Yes, a person should take part in this trial. No, a person should not take part in this trial. In each, on a case by case basis, it would need to be evaluated whether you are able, to take part in that trial based on your risks, based on where you are, based on your risks of getting it, etc., and all these other factors. But I think that what we can say is that this is not just a question we've discussed so far, the idea of whether you can put yourself at risk to save one other person, whether you can put yourself at risk to save many other people. There's actually something different over here. And this is not just a question of whether I can risk myself to save somebody else or whether I can risk myself to save many others. But it's a question of whether an individual can put themselves at risk in order to save society. And maybe it sounds like the same, but there's a nuance here, and it's very, very important that to get it right. So I want to go to two of the foremost authorities in this area that are alive today. One of them is Rabbi, who we've quoted already. We'll come back to him at the end. But one of them is also Rabbi Professor Avraham Steinberg. Anybody who's heard me speak about anything vaguely related to these areas before will have heard me quote him. He is really the world authority on Jewish medical ethics. He has single-handedly written 2 encyclopedias by himself. I don't know of any other person who has by themselves written an encyclopedia. He's also one of the world's leading child neurologists in Sharon Tzedek Hospital. He's also the editor of the Encyclopedia Talmudiyah. So we're talking about somebody who is head and shoulders above many. He's been to England many times as well. He's spoken here. Really the world authority on these things. So in his Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics, written a number of years ago, but he has a whole section there about, trials, not challenge trials per se, but in terms of any sort of, medical experimentation, which involves human beings, as opposed to things which, trials which involve animals. And he talks about, and like I said, it's an encyclopedia. So he gives the historical background, he gives the ethical background, he gives the medical background, the halachic background, all different things. So he talks about the ethical question of whether we can do trials, at all. This is what he says. He says, dilemma musarit. What is the moral dilemma in this research? It's about mitziat ha'izun. It's about finding the balance. Mitziat ha'izun nachon ben hatzorech lekidum refu'i letovat haklal. Whether on the one hand we want to advance medicine, which is going to benefit everybody, but on the other hand, sorry, and the same thing. And of every individual who would take part is, playing their part in order to advance medicine. But on the other hand, at the same time, we want to protect, the liberty and the rights of every individual. Right? We are not saying, that every individual becomes, subservient to, to the greater good. What's one person? This is not communist Russia. This is not the Torah's view. But there is a middle ground. The question is where that middle ground is. Right. And the irony is, of course, if it's going to be in the benefit of every individual for medicine as a whole to advance, but how do we do that without trampling on individual rights? So that's just a general sort of question. And then in a different place, this is in another book, which is not called an encyclopedia, but it basically is an encyclopedia. This came out a couple of years ago. It was more contemporary. These things are changing so often. He wrote a new book, I think it's 8 volumes or so, called Harefuah Halacha. And he says the following statement. He says, "Hatzibur v'aklal enenu like osef shel yechidim." And this is going to be the the crux of it, I think. That when we talk about a tzibur, right? And we know this from halacha. For example, we know this from when you're done with a minyan, right? It's not just, now there's all this discussion, individual prayer, communal prayer. I'm not getting into it, but there is a difference between 10 individuals who get together to daven as opposed to a minyan that gets together to daven. There is a collective entity. And therefore, a tzibur, a community, is not just a collection of individuals. This is something else. Therefore, it's going to have its own laws. It's going to have its own rules. There are needs of a community which are not the needs of many individuals. And yes, and sometimes it's going to come at the expense of the individual. But again, the chiddush over here, and this is what Judaism is saying, is that sometimes the collective, out trumps the individual, so to speak, but not always. We have to find that balance. We don't say that the individual no longer exists because we have a collective. In certain situations, there is a certain element of the collective that the individual wouldn't have. For example, one example that I might think of this is the example of war, example of an army. Right? We've been speaking back Pikuach Nefesh for months. We've been shouting from the rooftops, Pikuach Nefesh, Pikuach Nefesh, Pikuach Nefesh. For some reason, some people still aren't listening. I don't know why, but Pikuach Nefesh, right? That we can't put ourselves in a situation of danger. War, having an army, by definition, is a situation of danger. What happened to the rules of Pikuach Nefesh? So when a nation needs it, right, and there are halachot and there are rules as to when you can go to war, when you can't go to war, when you should go to war. But that's something which is going to be different than in any individual. And it's not just about war, but that's part of a functioning society. And we go back to Rabbi Shavais. Remember what Rabbi Shavais told us, that when can I put myself in when can I take on risk? When the element of risk, there's going to be a certain threshold of risk where if I'm putting myself in clear and present danger, I can't do that even in order to save somebody else. If it's a little bit of danger, it's probably not going to happen, so that I can do, and that maybe I should. But that's for an individual, he says. And this is what he says again. This is a quote from Minchat Asher, which came out specifically to do with Corona. He's written many tshuvot over the last few months. And this was a question exactly regarding experimental medicine, regarding challenge trials. And he repeats something which he says in his tshuvot, but says Rabbi Shavais the following principle, the following axiom. He says, I've explained in different places in my response, when there is a certain essential need for a society, a person can volunteer themselves. It's also very important. A person can volunteer. We can't coerce anybody into doing this. But a person can choose, and they can go and they can serve, even though there is a certain element of risk, which normally we say a person cannot take their risk on themselves. It's examples. A person can go and he can be a police officer, he can be a fireman, he can go and work in places where they have to go and save people from certain situations. Probably remember a few years ago there was that story of I think it was in Thailand, where there was those boys who went and they got trapped in a cave, and then the divers went in and they managed to bring them out. One of the divers tragically died inside the cave. These things happen. A person is going to go and volunteer or be in one of these professions, be in one of these units. They are taking increased risks. Some of them will not survive, right? You're taking on a greater element of risk than that which we'd expect from the rest of society. I remember a few years ago when Rabbi Shavais came and he spoke in the base, he spoke about vaccinations, not these vaccinations, just vaccinations in general. Some of you may have heard him. And I remember he spoke about this and he mentioned this idea, right? And what we're saying is we can't force any individual, take on the risk. That means they have to be in the police, to be in the fire station, fire service, to be a doctor, which under certain conditions. But can you imagine a society that had no hospitals and had no doctors and had no police force and had no firemen and had none of these things? That is not a functioning society. So the community, the society as a whole needs to have those things. It needs to have people that will take those risks. Can we force any individual to do it? No, that they have to volunteer for out of their own volition. And therefore he says, and you could argue whether this example is relevant to, he proves this as well from many interesting sources. I'm not going to go into them now. But you could argue whether this is relevant to our question or not. He feels that it is. And he says, and therefore, so too in our case, a person who is young, who is healthy, who's not at a high risk, yes, they can go and volunteer and expose themselves to the risk in a controlled manner in order to take this trial vaccine. Because again, the chance of them being affected adversely, again, there is a risk, but it's low. And you say even, it's higher than the risk you might normally take. Again, this fits into this category of trying to save society. And he goes on, he explains, I think the point is clear. Don't need to say it anymore. So I think just a final point of from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, very interestingly, he compares the whole scenario to war as well. One of the points he makes here is that, again, even if this is not done, even if this is not done in a way that is necessarily, controlled by the halachic authorities, nonetheless, if this is done by mumchim gdolim, right, by the medical experts, and it's done in the way that's most appropriate and mitigates risks, that would be permissible. One would be allowed to volunteer for such things. Maybe just to sum up, I think we've seen, and really, I think this question, the most interesting thing about it is not necessarily the answer that we get to at the end of the day, but how we get there and the process. And what we're looking at, as we've seen, it's a question of balancing risks. And it's not something we can give a black and white answer to. I think what we can say, certainly everybody agrees, is that anybody who is already at a higher risk should not and may not volunteer for one of these trials. The truth is, and I think if they're done responsibly, and they probably are, they wouldn't allow that. That everybody would agree with. Everybody would agree that you cannot force anybody to do one of these trials. This, by the way, is one of the questions also from an ethical perspective, and this is something that many people are grappling with. How you get informed consent for a trial like this, even if a person signs a piece of paper and says they are, they're willing to do it, and they say they understand the risks. It's not so clear that they really do understand the risks. There may be social pressures, there may be biases and things, and this is, one of the things the medical community is grappling with: how we, in general, how we get informed consent for any procedure, but certainly for something like this. But everybody would agree from a halachic standpoint as well, you would need informed consent. And beyond that, as we've seen, there certainly is room to say that these trials, again, ultimately for the betterment of humanity, ultimately for saving lives, is room to perform them. There is room for a person, again, to maybe volunteer to engage in it, so long as it's all done in the way that is mitigates the risk to the best degree possible. Okay, I know it's we've spoken about a lot to take in. If people have questions that you want to ask, again, if people want to digest, if people think about things afterwards and want to discuss further, so feel free to just send me a WhatsApp or whatever. But if anybody wants to ask a question now, the floor is yours.
Where does the word force come in? Like, when is it forced? When is it encouraged? Where's the line? Is there a line there? What was said? Is giving money almost similar to forcing in some ways because of that?
That's a good question. Yeah. So I mean, as you say, everybody agrees, and again, whether it's halachic or ethically or from whatever standpoint that you cannot force. Even if you don't have money, how you determine consent to these things. This is it's a big question which everybody is grappling with, and I don't think there's a satisfactory answer yet. As unsatisfactory as that is, it's not so easy. Now the question about money is an interesting one, because we've seen This is one that appears in many different places. But we've seen a person is allowed to take risk for the sake of parnasa, right? For the sake of livelihood. And if a person, you might say, so a person doesn't have money. I don't know how much they're offering for this. So there would be an argument to say, well, that's an extra factor to say that that a person is allowed to enter into this risk. Of course, there's a counter argument to that, which is, the money is just a form of exploitation, and that's that's actually taking away the person's ability to make that free choice. So now I think in terms of this, the poskim probably would be less encouraged by the idea of paying somebody to do this. I think that's probably going to be because of take more sort of the pressure that's going to take their choice away. But again, it's not black and white. Okay. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you at the next one.
Thank you very much, Rob Joel. Very, very
I know you're frozen. I don't know if anybody else.
Every time. See you all next week. Look out for the poster.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.